Hey, it's Jason from Bohemia Bees, and we're going to do something that's kind of important as a beekeeper to learn. It takes a lot to understand your bees and learn enough about bees to do the right things to help them flourish in your apiary. But inevitably, if you overwinter your hives, or at some point during the year, you could have a colony that collapses. We're going to focus this video on an overwintered hive that didn't make it, right? So naturally, many of us invest a lot of money in our bees, and a colony like this that was flourishing in the fall that no longer is alive is, it's definitely a sad moment opening that lid for the first time when spring rolls around and seeing a bunch of dead bees. So I'm going to speak to a couple different things that I do when I assess one of these colonies to see if we can gauge as to what might have caused the colony to not make it through winter. And we'll go from there. We'll see what we have. Now, granted, there's no activity in this hive. There's some dead bees here that in a cluster, which we'll talk about. We had an inner feeder in here that's solid. There's probably about an inch of feed in the bottom of it. These frames to the left of the feeder, right here, and even up to where the cluster is at, the small cluster that's remaining, the dead cluster, were full of honey. So the first thing when you're assessing your colony, you're going to observe what you see on the outside, and then you'll dissect it to understand what maybe happened inside. You're going to look at clues that naturally this hive perished because it was a victim of robbing. All this extra wax and syrup, or really syrup, but extra sticky tackiness that's honey that's been brought out were by robbing bees. They get basically covered in the flurry of tearing apart the cappings. The front door here has cappings just piled up in front of it and inside, which is another sign that it was being robbed out. That's not why this hive perished. It's why what happened after the hive perished. So what we're going to do is try to determine why it didn't make it, why they couldn't defend this small front entrance here this winter. We had several days where it was very, very cold, and then several days where it was mild, so the temperature fluctuation can impact a colony's ability to survive. It creates a moisture. We had a way for the moisture to be pulled up out of the colony so that we can ensure that we didn't have as much moisture. That's already been removed. The shim that was here that had a top entrance, which is how the robber bees were coming and going, has been removed. And we're down to the brood box. It's typically, we overwinter single deeps here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Some do double deeps and others, but we find that we can control the colony and its survival based on the number of bees going into winter, whether it's queen right, it's brood, its volume of bees, definitely treating for mites and such. And so that's a couple things we're going to do. We're going to tear apart the hive one by one, get to where the cluster is, see what we can identify, look for things like, does it still have a queen, or did it still have a queen? Did it have resources? Were Varroa mites an issue? One way to look at that is to scoop up any dead bees on the bottom board and do a wash and to see if any mites fall off. Now, some of those mites may have left those dead bodies or carcasses and moved to the ones up here, so we'll observe them as well. But we're hopeful that mites were not the issue. So we're going to go ahead and pull this apart and see what we find. So let's start on the outside and get this feeder out of here and pull it up out of the box so we can dissect it. The outside frame here, now I have broken through a couple of this, so it's not going to crack like most. Just looking at this because I wanted to find a good example to share with you as to what to look for. So these frames have already been cracked apart with my tool, so that's why they didn't make that noise. But when I first pulled them apart, naturally they're propolis tight, so you're going to have to do that to break them apart and lift that frame out of your box. So this is a frame that was honey, and one thing you can immediately see if your colony is being impacted by robbing, you'll see that the cappings are really rough across the toppings, almost like they were just ripped off and shredded off. And if you look down the bottom, you'll see all sorts of cappings on the bottom, right? But honey used to cover this whole entire frame on both sides, and it was a heavy frame. And you can see where this is very smooth, but this is very rough up here, because that's where the honey was. And they basically, the robbing bees came in and ripped into those cells and ate the honey out. So there's a sign that, okay, check off let's do a list, right? If you check off, was it resources? Did they run out of food? Well, if they're robbing after they're dead, then chances are they didn't run out of food. But that still could have been an issue. Let's take a look further. We're looking at our next frame. You can see a couple bees here that were either from the cluster that were foraging around on the frame that are now dead. Okay, still another sign, just really another sign of a solid resource frame that was pillaged by the robbing bees. Then we're going to go to the next frame, pull that out, and on this frame you can see the same exact thing. Okay. Other things that I'm looking for is if I see any like old queen cells in the middle that have been hatched out maybe a while ago. Maybe they requeened and they didn't have enough time for her to get mated. Maybe we lost our queen. Maybe that's what happened. But if we use the example of the size of the cluster for a single size deep, you want a nice big, basketball sized cluster to go into winter. And then it will naturally get down to about the size of a grapefruit. But that's what you want to look for. Here's another frame. Looks like there was some honey that was pillaged there too as well. You'll notice, okay, so this is different than what you've seen. There's a couple spots where there's some brood patches that have never hatched out. That's possible. If there's a large patch of brood, that's concerning. That may mean that they moved away from where the resources were and they left the brood behind to essentially die. The one thing that I always do when I see little patches of brood like this is I'll pick at it and look what comes out of it. If it's a solid, just dead bee like that, it's fine. If it comes out and there's like a ropey, like sticky looking stringy mess that comes out of it, that's a sign for AFB. Doesn't mean that it was AFB, but it's a sign you want to watch for. So you'll want to make sure that if you see that, to immediately quarantine this hive, immediately test it for AFB, and take precautions against it. I'm not going to talk about AFB on the call, but on this phone, but I do want to point that out. So that bee is just a dead bee that's been in there that did not emerge out. We're getting closer to our cluster here as we look at the frames. One interesting thing I can see about this frame, okay, well this doesn't look like it's been pillaged, but this one looks like it has a bunch of sugar inside of it, okay? So what was happening here was the bees were going in and harvesting the dry sugar out of the feeder and storing it closer to where the nest would have been. If your brood's nest is over here and they had honey over here, they couldn't get to that honey as fast, so they're not going to take that honey and move it. They're getting what they can to store in here, and that's the crystallized sugar that they've put in there. And that looks like that's on both sides that they've done that as we're getting closer to the brood's nest. Okay, the next two frames are where the brood's nests are. And I'll pull it out like a bookend so I can show you. And if you pull that out and look at the outside of this, we see just, there looks like some dead bees. It's like the outside of the cluster. Maybe that's where they died. And I see some pillaging here, but it's fairly smooth, the rest of this. Fairly smooth. What does that mean? It likely means that they didn't have but a little bit of honey right here to eat. And then when they ate it all, they starved. Okay, let's look at the other side. On the other side, this is interesting. So on this side, we have a small outside of the cluster as well, and we have some more brood, right? We have some brood that we're going to do that quick pick test. Again, just another dry bee. It looks like they started to lay eggs here. There was no resources on this frame. So they didn't have the bee bread or the nectar resources or the hot honey resources to feed or maintain this brood. And as the cluster moved away and into the next frame, there might have been resources there as why they started to lay there. So let's take a look. Let's open this up like a book. Okay? The reason why I open it like a book is because it tells a story. Okay, so if you look at this frame, it's similar to the last frame in that they don't have a lot of space around the edges for resources. Here's where your cluster is. I hope everyone can see that. And then if we take a look a little bit closer in the cluster, we're looking for a queen. There's our queen, okay? So I don't know if anybody can see this or not, but right there is your queen and their nest. See how they're kind of around the queen? And they're basically trying to get a brood nest going. No resources, again, more resources over here, right? And it looks like, or more brood over here that came out. And if you pop some of those, I'm seeing dry as well. It's not stringy. So again, it looks like they started to try to get going, then they moved over here and fed on the resources, and their last thing that they did was basically eat and eat and eat and eat till they could. One other thing I've noticed is that these bees have a haze of mold on them, a little bit of haze of dusty mold on them, or growth of fungus. What does that mean? They created their own moisture in the hive in this cluster that they need to keep at 93 degrees to keep the brood going. Their faces are down in the cells, which means they were eating as much as they can to keep themselves alive. But the cluster just wasn't big enough. I mean, it was the size of an orange, if that, maybe half an orange. So the bee volume wasn't there to maintain the colony through the remainder of the winter when we had the next cold snap. And that last cold snap was really cold back in about 2 weeks ago. We had some snow, and then it got a little warm. So naturally, if they die off and they're not fanning their wings or they're not maintaining and grooming themselves and they die off, then this is where the mold comes in. So we're gonna pull our queen out of that. I stick her in a tincture of lemongrass oil because she's a mated queen, just because I think it gives a little bit of a boost to help with swarm traps. Same thing on this side over here, some bees are there. The first inspection that I'll do for mites is I'll look very closely at this particular frame and I'll look at the bodies of the bees. I'll observe if there's mites on the bodies of the bees, and I'm not seeing any right yet. I mean, we could potentially have a few. I'll show you how we can kind of test for that. Okay, let's look at this last frame and then we'll take a look at the mites. Last frame looks like there was some outside sugar storage occurring, and it looks like some inside pollen that was close to them. That's about all I see. So definitely some bees on the bottom. Let's take a look at the bottom board. We're going to pull this off. Our bottom board, well, definitely a telltale sign what's happening here. This is like a story, right? So look at these bees right here. Okay, that's how big the cluster was on those two frames. And it slowly got smaller and smaller to where it just then died. So the more bees that were here and there's less bees here, that's all that was left. That's maybe less than a half a pound of bees, not enough to maintain a colony into winter. And then you see all the cappings over here and the dead carnage of bees from the robbing event of stripping those other hive or those other frames. And there's, of course, where the feeder was. And then, of course, you see some mold and mildew up around the edge over here. That tells me that they had some moisture in the hive towards the front, and that naturally, as the cluster got smaller, they just couldn't get the moisture out. They couldn't maintain it. And then, of course, you have all these cappings, like I said, that are really just everywhere in there. So let's do some scanning of the bees on the bottom to see if I see a large amount of mites or not. As I push them away, I should see mites on the bottom board if there was a problem with mites. Not that there weren't any mites, because every colony has mites, but I'm looking for lots of mites. And I'm not seeing any right out of the gate, but that doesn't mean they're not there. Let's do an alcohol wash on this cluster of bees and those bees to see what we can find. You're going to take a Varroa MiteCheck. I'll put a link to this in the description where I get this. This is what I normally do my check for them. And I'm going to take those bees right off the bottom. Right off the bottom. Okay. Getting a good amount of bees in there this time. And I'm going to do something unique too, which is scrape once, twice, because I want to see if there's a lot of mites in here, right? So if I'm scraping up mites, I'm scraping up mites. And then we're, of course, going to see mites up here. So I'm getting a few of those. Look at that mold. They really weren't there. They've been dead for a little while. That's a shame. Let's get these. That's what moisture will do in a hive. That'll kill a hive just as much. Get too much moisture. Okay. Now we got a lot of bees in here. Okay. Take your alcohol. This is just standard 70% alcohol. I like this I can never say that. Isopropyl. Soaking down those bees. That's just going to pull the mites off them if there's any mites in there. And you're filling that up. There we go. Put a little bit more in. Nope, we're at the top. We're good. I'm going to go ahead and shake this up for a few minutes, and we'll be right back. Okay, we're back. So when you use this and you have all that dirt that you just put in there, not just bees, there's a different way you have to look at it just so you can make sure that you get what you want. So what I do is I shake it up and I turn it upside down, and then I pour it back, and then I look at it like that. So there's still a lot of dirt in there, but you should see inside that actual container, and I can't really show it right here because of tilt. You should see a littering of mites. I see a lot of debris, and if I look at it and I flip it around, I'm not seeing, but okay, there's one, maybe two. I see two. I see two, and then floating on the side, I see 3, 4, 5. 5, 6. 6 mites. So I'm probably missing a few, but I think the point I'm making here is that these bees had 6 mites out of the dead bees on the bottom, and some of those mites might have went away, might have gone on other bees that were robbing it, might have just perished. The mites may not be giving a good reflection. So I'm going to double that number, 10 mites, right? 5 to 10, 10 to 12 mites in a bunch of bees that were remaining. As a percentage of the bees that I looked at, the mite load is definitely not what I would think is of too much concern. Did they have mites? Sure, they had mites. They all have mites. Are they of a concern to where I think mites are what killed this colony? No, I don't think that's the case. I believe if I had to make an honest assessment on what killed this colony, it was just pure volume of bees, running out of resources, not being able to move that cluster to where the resources were. I mean, there was a frame and a half between those 3 frames that were over on the other side that had all that honey in it. If they made a decision to move that direction rather than this direction, where these frames weren't really drawn out as much and didn't have a lot of stores in them, then maybe that's why. The other thing to consider is that there was not a lot of pollen on this side, and there was a frame of pollen over here that we saw in the one. So they may be moving more towards the pollen and the bee bread, and if by moving to there, that's where they ran out of the honey resources. The point I'm making here is that overwintered hives, you will lose them. It is a sad thing. It's an expensive hobby, and you will lose bees throughout the winter. We are very lucky here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland that we try to practice sustainable beekeeping techniques so that we don't have as many losses. We keep it under usually 20% losses. Sometimes we'll spike a little bit, but we will get 20 to 30% max losses. We've never seen more than that in this apiary. So I'm very blessed to have that luck. Do whatever we can to give the bees what they need going into winter, making sure that we effectively have a treatment program, whatever that may be, a combination of several things, not one thing, many things, good genetics, strong colonies. This just was a weaker colony. The colony was probably, requeened late, and she was mated late so that she didn't have time to put together the amount of winter bees that are needed. And they just couldn't keep themselves warm. They couldn't keep the moisture out. They couldn't, do what they needed to do to maneuver themselves back to the other side of the colony, these frames, and get to where the resources were. So I've got a couple ideas on how we can do better next year with the single deeps and the things that we're doing. Maybe it's taking that feeder and pushing it on the other side, or putting it so that we can see there's a balance of resources throughout the colony and not just feel the weight of the colony and thinking that it's good to go into winter. Again, I don't think it was a resource thing. I don't think it was a mite thing. I absolutely believe it was a bee volume thing. And it could have been a queen that was requeened. She didn't have a marking on her, so we mark all our queens. That's another thing. So that's probably the answer, and I probably just answered my own question, which is she has no mark on her. So she's a mated queen that probably was mated late. probably superseded, and I just didn't see the supersedure cell, or they tore it down, and they requeened her late, and they didn't get enough to be able to build the volume of bees back going into the winter. So there's my assessment. I hope the video helps you. For those that are not beekeepers, yes, this is the unfortunate thing that beekeepers have to deal with, right? Is overwintering hives and getting them to survive. We lose hives all the time. We do sell packages. We do sell nukes here at Beekeeping Apiary. We sell a limited amount of each, and we are mostly sold out on all of our, well, we're sold out of all our nukes and mostly sold out on the packages. We have a few left on our website. So if you're looking to get bees this year to replace a lost hive, we can get you a package or two, but that's about it. If you're a new beekeeper wanting to get involved with bees, this is the nature of being a beekeeper. So get ready for that, losing that colony. And if you're a first or second year beekeeper and you're still trying to figure this out because you lost all your colonies, be patient, dissect your colony the way we just did, think about what could have caused it, and then make adjustments, right? Maybe it's a reduction of space in the hive. Maybe I didn't need a 10 frame deep. Maybe I only needed a 5 frame nuke for the colony that was here going into winter. And I had hoped that potentially that queen or whatever was laying was on a path to build back before winter got here. So again, all sorts of things we can always question. I hope this was informative. Appreciate everyone watching. Thanks for joining us here at Beekeeping Apiary, where beekeeping is definitely more than a hobby. It's an obsession. Thanks a lot.